You are listening to the Westminster Hour. Let's meet my panel this evening. Claire Coutinho, the Conservative MP for East Surrey. Before entering Parliament at last year's election, she worked in banking and as an advisor at the Treasury, where she's now a parliamentary aide. Labour's Stephen Kinnock represents the Welsh seat of Aberavon. He's a shadow Foreign Office Minister and sits on a number of parliamentary committees covering European affairs. We welcome to Ireland's ambassador to the UK, Adrian O'Neill. He's previously served in his country's embassy in Washington and as a senior official in its Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And Kate Proctor is our expert guide to everything moving at Westminster. And my goodness, isn't it moving? She is the political editor of the Politics Home website and editor of Parliament's in-house magazine, The House Magazine. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining us. And, well, you'll know that just as we were preparing to come on air tonight and have our conversation, news broke that the Prime Minister was self-isolating after spending time with a Tory MP who subsequently tested positive for coronavirus. This just as Boris Johnson, of course, was planning a relaunch or reset or whatever you wish to call it after a toxic, turbulent week in Downing Street and the departure of two key aides, Dominic Cummings and Lee Kane. Now, Claire Coutinho, you've just heard the news, as we have. What do you make of it?
Well, it's twice now that this Prime Minister has experienced that you don't get a special exemption from COVID if you're the PM. But, you know, the rules are the rules. They're there to stop the spread. And I'm glad that he'll be taking appropriate steps to follow that. And obviously, we do have things like the miracle of Zoom, Teams, FaceTime. And I'm sure that he'll be continuing to keep the show on the road.
Well, Kate Proctor's just had a copy of a message that maybe, Claire, you yourself received. Kate, just tell us what Boris Johnson's been saying to his backbenchers.
Well, he's saying on this message to MPs, so will this slow me down or in any way impede my work in the next few days? Of course not. So he's saying he's going to be carrying on. And, you know, he's got so much to do. He says, yes, we have the spending review and the integrated security review and the small matter of the EU talks. But we also have Zoom and other miracles, similar to what your guest was just saying. And he says, you know, he's more confident than ever that the exceptional measures will end on December the 2nd. And he says they're going to continue to pummel COVID into submission, which sounds very Johnsonian in its language.
Pummeling COVID, yeah. Yes, Claire.
Yes, exactly. Quite right. And I think, you know, all the priorities he's set out there have been exactly the right ones. We've got to continue the spending review. We need to keep going with our work intensively to get a deal and obviously getting through COVID and getting the country back on its feet.
All right. Well, lots of those issues will come up during our conversation. But let me bring you in, Stephen Kinnock. Number 10 saying Mr. Johnson will continue to work from Downing Street. They're exploring ways for the Prime Minister to take part in parliamentary business remotely. So I guess PMQs on Wednesday will be a bit different to usual.
Yes, and of course we wish him well. It's good to hear that he's doing the right thing. And, you know, of course, it's a little bit of a worry with so much going on. It's so important for the Prime Minister to be on top form and to be fully available and engaged. But I'm sure we can use technology in the right way. And yes, PMQ is very important. The Prime Minister's questions goes ahead on Wednesday, extremely important. Keir Starmer has a lot of questions for the Prime Minister of that, there can be no doubt. And so I hope they'll use technology in the right way to make sure it happens on Wednesday.
Well, we may well see developments along those lines in the next hours or days. Adrian O'Neill, this virus never ceases to surprise or alarm us, does it? I mean, you know, it is so unpredictable and so vicious and tragic for so many people. In terms of the Brexit talks, it means perhaps no 11th hour face-to-face bit of diplomacy to get the trade talks over the line. I remember October 2019 and that meeting with Leo Varadkar and Boris Johnson breaking that last big Brexit stalemate and setting up the withdrawal agreement.
Indeed, Caroline, and so do I. But I mean, I wonder in this occasion whether that would be necessary in any event. I think a lot of the more recent contacts the Prime Minister has had at EU level with EU leaders like President von der Leyen has been, you know, but through VC and other kind of remote contacts. So I'm sure it's possible for him to stay in close touch with the negotiations, for Lord Frost to report back to him on the conduct of those negotiations, and then to interact at at senior political level as he needs to. But like Stephen said, our thoughts with the Prime Minister, and indeed with Mr. Anderson as well. And so let's hope, as I said, that it is just precautionary and nothing further develops.
Mr. Anderson, Lee Anderson, the Tory MP that you're referring to there, with whom the Prime Minister had his meeting, and after which he was told to isolate. Kate, we were talking about this being a reset week after all of these turbulent events inside Number 10. This picture painted of internecine warfare in Downing Street, briefing, counter-briefing. Even his own fiancée caught up in some of that briefing, and a real toxic soap opera of clashing personalities. So a reset needed, in his view?
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's been an absolutely torrid week. And as political journalists, we were, given the sense very much that there would be a reset. And actually, we received information this evening that, a whole agenda. There was a whole list of things that that Boris Johnson wanted to do. And that also included having discussions with MPs. And I assumed that they would have been face to face. And that, he just can't do any of these things now. And it's just, another absolutely bonkers twist in this, political psychodrama that's going on, that, Boris Johnson is now going to effectively be in a room having to do everything over Zoom to try and reset. And if he has to have anyone standing in for him at any point in the next couple of weeks, it's going to be quite a weak look for him and not something he'll want.
He's got a lot of bridges to rebuild with his backbenchers, hasn't he? I mean, I'm sure you've been hearing the same sorts of things. Backbenchers describing him as having been taken captive by the Vote Leave team inside Number 10. Another backbencher said to me that they just wanted the Prime Minister to shake off this impression that he bore the imprint of the last person that sat on him.
Yeah, there has been a lot of descriptions of Boris Johnson as being someone very malleable and someone that's just, not able to really come up with his own viewpoints. And I really don't think that's the case. I think there's been a lot of briefing about him and his character and the fact he's indecisive. I'm not sure that's quite the case, but, he really did need this face-to-face time, not only with, the public, but also with MPs to try and reassert himself in a really strong way. So, social media and, videos are going to be doing a lot of heavy lifting, I think, this week for him to try and rebuild his reputation, which, to be honest, isn't, it really does need to be done.
And particularly a meeting was planned with the Northern Research Group. These MPs, representing those Leave seats, the Red Wall seats, they wanted reassurance from him, didn't they?
Yeah, they want a lot of reassurance that the levelling up agenda is still on the cards. They don't feel like it is at the moment. And also we need to remember that the free school meals incident, which is something that Cummings and Lee Kane have both been embroiled in terms of a very poor communication strategy around it, poor decision making. Those blue wall Tories up in the North and the Midlands, they really suffered from their constituents being very, very upset about the free school meals not being continued over Christmas.
Well, Claire, I imagine you're relieved that you've been on the Number 11 side of that Downing Street wall rather than the Number 10.
Well, I mean, I just think the one thing that I would pick up on there is that actually a lot of these meetings would have been happening by Zoom anyway, because we are in a lockdown. It's not like, the Prime Minister can go to public rallies or see large groups of people in person at one time at the moment anyway. So I wouldn't sort of over how different the plans are going to be.
All right, but what about the briefing and the counter-briefing and the toxic atmosphere? That's what I was referring to. Did you have a glass to the wall sometimes trying to hear what was going on, a bit of the shouting and backbiting? I
think the walls are rather thicker than that, I'm afraid. But I kind of feel it's a bit like welcome to politics, because as long as I've remembered, there's always been these sort of blow-ups in politics, whether it's Alistair Campbell or Damien McBride in the Labour years or the Cameron years, there are people as well. And I think the truth of the matter is the Prime Minister is allowed to appoint whoever he wants to help him. And the most important thing that he has is an agenda, which for us is delivering Brexit, levelling up and getting the country back on its feet.
I think that the timing of all of this, though, is incredibly unfortunate, isn't it? And doesn't the Prime Minister bear some responsibility for what's been happening? I mean, presentationally and policy-wise. I mean, how could he have been unaware of the problems storing up? The exam fallout, for one, the intervention by Marcus Rashford on free school meals, as Kate mentioned there, as well as all these personal animosities building up.
Well, I mean, you point out free school meals, and I'd agree with you there that the communications could have been better. But then if you look at some of his achievements, we are within touching distance of a deal on Brexit. We do have a vaccine, mass testing coming around the corner in terms of the pandemic. And actually, he's been at the forefront of all of those decisions as well.
Indeed, but you would acknowledge that the atmosphere has been far from ideal in recent weeks. And you're losing Allegra Stratton from the Chancellor's side. She's been recruited to the newly formed role up fronting the televised press briefings, hasn't she? And speaking on behalf of the Prime Minister. How instrumental do you think she will have to be in moving on from the recent problems and offering the sort of reassurance that Kate was discussing earlier?
Well, I mean, I think all of those people will be crucial. And, I'm really glad she's a very talented individual. So I'm glad that she'll be there. But you've also got people like Munira Mirza, who heads up the policy unit, also highly regarded. And people like Neil O'Brien, who used to be the person who came up with the Northern Powerhouse policy, who's going in to do some policy commission on the levelling up agenda as well. So he will have a powerful team in place.
And Stephen, Claire mentioned there that these things are nothing new. Turbulence in Downing Street, nothing new. Labour PMs haven't been immune, have they? What do you anticipate will happen with a change of personnel now?
Well, I mean, the context here is extraordinary. We're facing, just about 50 days or so until we leave the Brexit transition period, a massive change for our country. We've got this deep crisis around the coronavirus and the impact it's having on the economy. And whilst all this is going on, the Prime Minister is having to deal with a soap opera and palace intrigue. And I think that's the worrying thing about this is we really need our government and our Prime Minister focused on the issues that really matter to the British people. And he's being distracted with all this stuff. I mean, fundamentally, you're seeing a pattern of behaviour around all the U-turns from Huawei to free school meals to the planning regulation stuff to the second lockdown, the test and trace failures, the exams fiasco. We're seeing this kind of growing picture of incompetence and dither and delay, and I think it's being compounded by the clear sort of internecine warfare that's going on. But at the end of the day, the British people will judge the Prime Minister on results, and he's got his oven-ready Brexit deal, which doesn't look particularly oven-ready, the levelling up agenda, and the test and trace and dealing with coronavirus. So, if he can get the act together and start to deliver on some of those things, I'm sure people will forgive all the sort of stories about people stabbing in the back and factionalism in Downing Street. But at the end of the day,
really, you'd forgive that, would you? You'd forgive that?
Well, look, what prime ministers and governments are judged by their results, but I think we can generally draw the conclusion that if you're striving towards these huge things that's been promised to the British people in the Conservatives' 2019 manifesto, but the Prime Minister is being dragged into having to sort out people, fighting like cats in a sack in his own team. That's a big distraction for him at the worst possible moment for the country.
Kate Proctor, the government has been plunged into chaos in the middle, not just of a coronavirus global pandemic, but at that crucial stage in the Brexit negotiations. Lord Frost, the UK negotiator, is not among the people leaving his post. He remains at the Prime Minister's side, or certainly working on the Prime Minister's behest. Do you think he's turning on the oven, heating it up, ready for the deal?
I think, going into talks again this week, I think Frost was very clear, to be honest, that there's not going to be any shifting, at least publicly. Those red lines are still in place. He was saying that, we want to take back control of our laws, trade and our waters. And to me, that showed that there'll be no budging on the fisheries issue, which is really becoming one of the very intense talking points in these final days of negotiations. And he said, I will not be changing from this position. So he was letting people know, I think, that he's going into it with this agenda. Whatever happens around the sides or in a few weeks' time, that might not be, anything that's particularly to do with him. He was just trying to say really to the public that I am going in with those initial red lines and that's what I'm going to stick to. So I think he's been pretty firm, to be honest, and we'll just have to see what happens. I mean, it's like an ever-changing deadline at the moment. We're hearing that things have to be in place now by November the 19th, and then it could be later on in November, and then all of this has to go through the European Parliament at some point and be ratified. So there really isn't very much time left at all.
That's right. There is an EU leaders meeting, a virtual meeting due this Thursday, but then we're being told that perhaps the deadline will shift to the following week. Adrian O'Neill, from the Irish perspective, You're watching 46 days, is it, till the transition period ends and the UK starts that new relationship with the EU? We've had all these deadlines coming and going, and the latest we hear is maybe next Monday the 23rd of November. Is that really it? Do you think, could this be finally the final week?
Caroline, well, I think it has to be, or very close to it in any event, because the European Parliament is ultimately, if we manage to do a deal, is going to have to ratify this deal in a full plenary sitting. I think the last scheduled meeting for the European Parliament, a full plenary meeting, is about mid-December. If you work back from that, and then the time that is required to actually write up a full legal text and translate it into all the various languages, you come back to a date around now, certainly at the latest in mid-November. So I think we are in extra time at this stage. That very hard working clock is not only ticking, but I think it's ticking very loudly at this stage. So I think on that, both the EU and the UK government are in agreement.
And what do you think needs to happen then to get everyone to sign on the dotted line?
Well, I think there's, these negotiations are being conducted in a kind of a black box at this stage, and none of us are particularly privy to the details, other than those who are on the negotiating team on both sides. But it does seem as if that a lot of progress has been made on some of the, I'd say secondary issues, but nonetheless quite important issues. And indeed, apparently, even we understand from media reports, a text agreed. But on the three crux issues that have been outstanding now for several months, namely fisheries, the level playing field, and governance, on those three aspects, it seems to be the case that there are still very significant differences. And I think what needs to happen in the next week is that there needs to be compromise and accommodation on both sides to try and bridge those differences.
Who do you think would lose most in a no-deal scenario, Ireland or the UK?
Well, I think the Taoiseach said that it would be ruinous. I think for both countries. It's interesting that I was interested, for example, to hear a statistic last week of Irish exports of food and drink to the UK total about 4 billion per annum. This is a particular area which is in danger, because if there was no FTA, the tariff on food and drinks would be very high. But interestingly, the UK exports to Ireland more or less an equivalent amount of 4 billion in exports of food and drink. So it too would be subject to tariffs. So I think on both sides a lot of damage could be done. And I think it's in nobody's interests that we end up on the 1st of January, not only having to endure the change that will occur at ports and so forth because of the checks and controls that will be necessary in any event, because the UK will be outside the single market and the customs union. But on top of that, to have a whole series of checks related to tariffs and the disruption that's going to cause to industry on both sides of the Irish Sea.
Claire Coutinho, I don't know how much you come into contact with sheep farmers in your constituency, possibly not that much, but George Eustace, the Environment Secretary, was saying today if Britain fails to strike a trade deal with the bloc, then sheep farmers could diversify into beef. And he said if we're not importing as much beef from Ireland, then those mixed beef and sheep enterprises will be able to diversify into beef. That sounds terribly simplistic, and I'm sure sheep farmers will not be relishing that prospect one bit.
Well, George Eustace has a farming background, and so I'm sure he will know himself how long these things take. But I think the real thing that we want to do is to get a deal so that we're not in that scenario. But we do know that sheep farming would be one of the worst affected sectors in farming.
And how confident? You mentioned earlier that you think we are on the brink of a deal. Do you think we are in the end stage now? It's been described as move week by Simon Coveney, the Irish Foreign Minister.
Well, yes, I followed his comments this morning and I thought they were quite positive. He said it was doable. I used to work on Brexit legislation before I came in to be an MP. And the one thing that really strikes me is how far we've come over the past year and a half. And actually, I really do think we are quite close now. And as Adrian mentioned, there's only sort of a few issues left. And I hope that we will see something come out of this intensive process this week.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, the talk about fishing, and yet fishing is what, 0.1% of UK GDP. Is it really something that should be allowed to end the trade talks? Could they be allowed to founder on this issue?
Well, absolutely, because I think fishing is the livelihoods of lots of people in the country around our coastal communities. And so it is an incredibly important issue. When people talk about it in terms of GDP, I think they need to remember sometimes there are real humans behind it. And this is their industry. And it's something that we have been very passionate about trying to bring back to these shores.
And does that mean that, to put it in very simple terms, do sort of fish trump lambs and sheep then?
Well, I don't think it will be looked at in that context. I think the way it will be looked at is overall, is this a good deal for the country?
Stephen, the EU, of course, is one of the biggest financial contributors to local and regional economic development in Wales and regeneration projects. You've been looking at post-Brexit funding, haven't you, for the regions? How does the future look then for projects like that?
Well, very worrying because the Shared Prosperity Fund, which is what the government has promised to bring in to replace the EU structural funds, is still, to use the ambassador's phrase, a black box, I'm afraid. We don't know anything about it. We don't know the overall size of the envelope. We don't know how decisions are going to be made between the English, Scottish, Welsh and Northern Irish decision-making bodies. We don't know what kind of governance it will have. We don't know what the focal areas. And this is all supposed to be being announced with the Comprehensive Spending Review later this month. And there's been no public consultation whatsoever. So the government is shooting in the dark, really, because it hasn't had any feedback from the people who've been at the coalface actually delivering these projects. And we're really worried that it's going to be a kind of power grab where powers are going to be taken away from the devolved administrations. And there's also potentially going to be a reduction in money. There could be some double counting, rolling some of the money into areas where the Conservatives are looking to keep seats that they just won in December 2019 or win marginal seats, a real risk of pork barrel politics as well. So there's a real lack of transparency. We're very concerned about it.
I was pressing Claire on some of the problems with the negotiations, but isn't it the case that, ministers here say, look, we want the EU to negotiate and strike a deal in good faith, and they feel that there has to be a two-way process here?
Yeah, there's a deal there to be done. And obviously, we've got to look at what's being said in public, which looks pretty intransigent from both sides at the moment, particularly on the three issues of level playing field, fish and governance. But hopefully, behind the scenes, there is something more positive happening because the clock really is ticking. I worry as well about the internal market bill, because I think once the United Kingdom government came forward and said they're prepared to break international law, I think that had an impact on the mood music, and trust is really important.
Yeah, but Stephen, they say that they have to have that because it clarifies ambiguities in the withdrawal agreement and allows the UK government to decide the exit procedures for goods passing between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. They feel that they have to have it there if a deal doesn't happen.
But we're talking here about an internationally legally binding document that the UK government signed up to just a matter of months ago. It went through Parliament, and it was it also went through a general election. So the mandate was to deliver the oven-ready deal. And then you go back to that deal and say, oh, sorry, actually, there's a bit of it that we didn't like very much. It just doesn't have a very good impact on the mood music around these negotiations.
Just a quick word with you, Adrian. Even after Brexit, there are moves to maintain trade relations and economic development projects between some of the English regional authorities and the Republic of Ireland. Just briefly, tell us what's happening tomorrow and the hope of further ties developing between Ireland and the north of England.
Yeah, Caroline, thanks. Just before I do that, could I just have a quick word on the internal market bill? I mean, I think in response to the point that you made, the the withdrawal agreement and the Northern Ireland Protocol, did contain its own process and procedures and arbitration mechanisms and so on to address any differences in interpretation that there may be about the protocol. I think what is difficult in the Internal Market Bill is that it represents a unilateral effort by the British government to reinterpret the protocol without reference to the European Union. And I think that's what makes it so problematic and why it's been, in terms of the House of Lords earlier this week, why they voted so decisively to remove those provisions from the Internal Market Bill.
And it just, in a sentence, what's happening tomorrow about fair ties?
In a sentence, what's happening tomorrow? Well, I suppose it's a bit of the kind of the levelling up agenda, crossing the Irish Sea, in the sense that the metro mayors of Liverpool and Manchester are making a kind of a virtual visit to Ireland, where they'll have meetings with Leo Varadkar, our Deputy Prime Minister, and Simon Coveney, our Minister for Foreign Affairs, talking about the trade and investment agenda between that part of Northern England, the greater Liverpool and Manchester area, and how we develop those trade relationships. Okay. And in that context, Minister Coveney will probably make some announcement about the Irish government opening a consulate in the north of England to cover that region there. So it's an important day in terms of the intensification of relationships across the Irish Sea.
Now, Kate, a couple of other things are happening. I mean, we were going to be hearing about a 10-point green jobs revolution plan this week, which I presume will now be done sort of in a remote way on the green agenda, and proposals for planning reform, which have been criticised by a host of backbenchers, including Theresa May. Looks like there might be some change to that. That's
right. Yeah, it's the planning algorithm. So there was plans to try and work out where to build new homes by region using a mathematical model, and this has now had so much negative attention. MPs, particularly Conservative MPs, feel that it's very unfairly weighted to some of the, leafier, greener constituencies that are just having a whole swathe of mass housing put in. So it does sound like that isn't going to happen anymore. I think people are sick of algorithms and that kind of approach to governance.
Claire, are you sick of algorithms?
Well, I mean, I'm a former mathematician, so I do feel this year algorithms have got a particularly bad name. But I think the issue that, I sort of was struggling with, and there's no secret that has been controversial amongst my colleagues, is this idea that you would have a binding number decided by central government, then foisted onto a local community. And I think what would be much more palatable is if the local community could then speak to the central government, agree a number which was suitable for the area, and then that number was then binding. So you have a binding build-out rate, which would ensure that you are building the homes that we need.
Are you going to get that?
Well, I think ministers have been consulting. Obviously, all those consultations have gone in and they'll be responding to that in due course. But I mean, from what I've heard, I think that we will be getting some sort of changes and they'll be listening to the issues that have been raised.
All right. Well, we've got emergence from firebreak lockdowns in Wales. We've got a tier system still operating in Ireland. And of course, in England, Kate, looking towards that December the 2nd date with a number of backbenchers signed up to what's called the COVID Recovery Group, and they will oppose any further national lockdowns. Is this rebellion growing?
But I think the Prime Minister's been very clear that he doesn't want to have anything beyond December the 2nd anyway. So we might end up with this tiered system and it might be slightly different, although I would say that would be so complicated for the public that the 3-2-1 tier system is something they should go back into in December. But I think Boris Johnson absolutely means it. And, I read out some bits from a WhatsApp message that MPs were sent this evening, and Boris Johnson made it really clear again that December the 2nd is the absolute end of a national lockdown. I mean, sure, MPs are really annoyed, but I mean, on this one, I don't think that this rebellion's going to really go anywhere, because I think he's just going to give them what they want.
And Claire, you said that you back the current lockdown with a heavy heart and only on certain conditions. And you said you've received assurances that the exit from lockdown will be judged on local rates of infection and not on a national R rate. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely. And I do think it's crucial that we are coming out of this looking at a regional R rate, because we do know that it's incredibly damaging to the economy, to people's jobs, to be in a lockdown across the country.
And, does that automatically mean that regions will return to one of three tiers then, depending on the R rate?
Well, I think what we have now is we've got some time to see what's happened with those tiers that we put people into. I know that some of them have been quite successful, but I think there's a view that some of them maybe didn't work as well if you were in the very low tiers. So, I mean, this would be an opportunity to just look at the evidence and obviously go out of this into a system which is, from what we've seen, the best way that works.
Do you think there might have to be another lockdown in January or February if people drop their guard over Christmas and New Year?
I mean, I really hope not. I'm sure we will be telling people to continue to social distance over the Christmas season. And obviously, we've seen some other developments which give me some hope. So we've obviously got mass testing, which is being rolled out in Liverpool. And we've got a vaccine, which there's been sort of cautiously positive noises as well. So we'll have to wait and see.
And Stephen, as I mentioned, Wales emerged last week from its lockdown. Did it work? And what lessons do you think have been learned from it?
Well, I think it's too early to see the impact on the R rate yet. But what I do think is working really well in Wales is test, trace and isolate. And the reason it's working is because it is a public function that's being put in the hands of public local authorities. It's been highly decentralised, and as a result, they're getting contact rates in the high 80s. That's a real contrast with England, where the centralising and privatising instincts of the Conservative government have had a very, very negative impact on the success and contact rate, which I think is in the mid-60s. So I think there's also this tendency to we're seeing this kind of cronyism going on with contracts being handed out to people with connections to the Conservative Party and Tory donors. We're also seeing Serco being employed to do this test and trace on a highly centralised basis rather than trusting local authorities, the public health experts on the ground, the shoe leather testing and tracing, which is so much more effective, as the Wales experience is demonstrating. Right. So I think the key question about coming out of lockdown is, has this period in England been used to fix the test and trace system properly?
Just a quick response from you, Claire, to that charge of cronyism.
Well, I think when we were thinking about an approach which was either going to be an aggressive approach to procurement for something like PPE, for example, or one that was cautious, I think the public would agree that they wanted an aggressive approach, which is now seen by the extensive stockpiles that we have. And the one point I would just quickly make is that the Labour Party seemed to have retreated into this 1970s mindset that all private sector is bad. And 80% of the people in this country work in the private sector. And it's precisely the competition of the private sector that's driven the innovation to produce a vaccine.
OK, no agreement there then, I don't think, between you two on that. Adrian, you are operating a tier system in Ireland. Your current tier 5 is pretty similar to England's lockdown. But I guess your government will face the same pressure to lift restrictions next month in the run-up to Christmas. And then what happens after that? Micheál Martin, your Prime Minister, your Taoiseach, was warning people aren't going to be able to go on the lash.
Yes, Carolyn, you're right. Level 5, which we're on at the moment, which is the most restrictive level, is more or less equivalent to the regime here in England at the moment. And we've been in that now for over 3 weeks, with another 2 to 3 weeks to go. It's proven very effective. The numbers are going down, which is very encouraging. I think we're now the 4th lowest in terms of incidence across Europe, according to the ECDC. And obviously the government is going to have to, in the next week or so, begin to think about what we're going to kind of transition to come early December. And there are some very, very difficult calls to make there, because on the one hand, of course, everybody is looking forward to some kind of something that resembles a normal Christmas and a normal Christmas period. And on the other hand, doing so creates huge risks of receding the disease, and then finding ourselves in January having to impose another lockdown again, because the numbers have gone so high and the health service is being overwhelmed and under threat.
Absolutely.
So it's a very difficult call to be made.
Difficult decisions all round. Well, look, the pandemic has led to a lot of changes in the way that business is conducted at Westminster. We were discussing earlier, weren't we, about seeing Boris Johnson taking Prime Minister's questions on Zoom this week and maybe next week. Many backbenchers, of course, want more opportunities to participate remotely. And at the moment, MPs can put questions to ministers via video video link, but they just can't join in debates from home, even if they're shielding for medical reasons. And that led to a situation last week where we saw the former Minister Tracy Crouch, who's being treated for breast cancer, being unable to contribute to a debate on the disease. And she was pretty angry about that, and she made that clear. I was speaking to Tracy recently about her breast cancer diagnosis that she received in June, its impact on her personally and as an MP. I asked her what made her first suspect that there might be a problem.
Well, mine was quite simply that I had discovered a lump in my breast, and it was actually quite an obvious lump, and it was something that was very certain straight away. So the consultant was brutally honest and said it's highly likely to be cancer, and every part of me wanted her to say, but it could also be X, Y, Z. And from there, it all sort of kind of moved quite speedily. But, you know, it is something that when I put out my public statement, I felt very clear about saying, you know, please do check for symptoms, just reminding people to, if anything is unusual, to go and see your GP and get it checked out.
So this was June that you got the diagnosis. What's the treatment been like?
It's been okay. I had a double lumpectomy, so I had actually the scans came up and showed that I had 2 lumps. My cancer was tested to see what the likelihood of recurrence was going to be, and it came back at a higher risk recurrence, so chemotherapy alongside my age and everything else was the most appropriate treatment.
It's gruelling, isn't it? It must be gruelling.
It's hard, but the round that I'm about to have will be the halfway point of the whole thing, and after the treatment I will be at the same risk rating of everybody else in society, so of getting cancer again. I don't have cancer anymore. The cancer has been taken out of me, and the chemotherapy is very much about making sure it doesn't come back.
Well, that's a great message, and it must be very heartening for you. But still, the worry that there's been for you and for your family, how have they been coping with seeing you go through this?
My son doesn't really fully understand what's going on. He just thinks mummy has a poorly booby. He doesn't know what the word cancer means. He doesn't need to know, the fear factor around it that we as adults have. And, you know, my family have been incredible. My sister shaved her hair in solidarity of me losing mine and raised a phenomenal amount of money for charity. And so we're just getting on with it, really.
It's always the thing that people talk about, isn't it, with chemo, that's the one thing that actually makes it all come home to you. It really is happening. You know, I've lost my hair.
I was never particularly worried about losing my hair, but when it started to sort of kind of fall out, it was a bit upsetting. But I found shaving my head actually quite empowering. We are very much defined by our hair and our haircuts, and actually shaving off all my head has been something that's been quite a remarkable part of the journey.
And people have been able to see you from time to time on the Zoom discussions, haven't they, that have been set up as part of the measures brought in by Parliament during the coronavirus pandemic and the lockdowns. But being an MP is a pretty full-on job at the best of times. How have you been managing?
I actually think going through this right now, while we have virtual and hybrid proceedings, is probably the best time I could be going through it, because there are a lot of colleagues who are not in Parliament for a variety of reasons, and therefore we have this system set up to enable us to be able to dial in. Whereas pre-COVID, I wouldn't have been able to participate in questioning of the Prime Minister or Secretary of State for Health or whoever if we weren't in COVID times. So I can still fully participate in some of those proceedings. I can continue and carry on doing my emails. The one thing I'm not necessarily able to do, a lot of constituency visits, but then a lot of constituency visits are not happening because of coronavirus. So actually, in a way, and I don't mean this to sound insensitive, but this is a good time to have gone through this.
You presumably would like to see those measures remain in place for the foreseeable future. And maybe, would you say there's any merit in this hybrid model continuing long into the future?
I think while coronavirus exists, it's right that we can carry on with the hybrid system. I think there needs to be an expansion of it. I can't participate in other debates. I can't participate in Westminster Hall or backbench debates, only in questions. It could be better. But I do think that, it is something that the Speaker is actively considering.
And proxy voting?
I have a proxy vote, and I think I'm being a bit rebellious over pieces of legislation, and I think my proxy is rather enjoying living vicariously through me. I think it's working. I think it is a system that works well. It obviously existed for maternity and paternity leave, and hopefully I would like it to be expanded to other health conditions or bereavement leave or things like that in the future.
There's been a lot discussed about the economic cost of a lockdown, but also the cost to mental health and the issue of loneliness. You've long campaigned to draw attention to the prevalence of loneliness. How worried are you about the impact of the next few weeks on that problem and on mental health more broadly?
People will perhaps remember that I was the world's first loneliness minister. And the one thing that I would say that lockdown has done is it's really raised the understanding of loneliness across government, but also across society. And I think we need to recognise that it is a real thing and it has a huge health impact, as well as something that can impact on people's mental health. So I do think that lockdown will have catapulted the issue of loneliness up the government's agenda. But in the meantime, we have to try and find ways to support those who do find themselves in, these severe lonely situations.
What advice would you give to people then now, how to support somebody in their community that maybe is alone at the moment? What would your advice be?
I will certainly knock on the doors of some of the neighbours that I know that live by themselves to check that they're okay. You don't have to go inside. You can stand on the doorstep and see if they're okay. Do they need anything for the shops? Those are the sort of things that I think we can still do. We should be staying focused as to why we're doing this, and it is to keep capacity in the NHS. And as somebody, who in the next month will have 3 treatments, in my local hospital, as selfish as it sounds, I want to make sure that there is that capacity to continue that.
Tracy, we wish you all the best. We wish you well going forward. But just to finish, tell me what you think could be done better regarding cancer treatment, and how could you influence policy given the personal experience that your own treatment has brought?
I don't want to be known as that MP that had breast cancer for the rest of my life. I'd much rather be defined by some of the other things that I do in Parliament. But the truth is that because I've been through this personal experience, I have a much better insight into some of the challenges that the NHS faces in terms of treating cancer, but also some of the things that we ought to do in order to try and make sure that more people are getting treated for cancer. Maybe we ought to perhaps lower the breast screening age from 50 to 40, for example. Should we have more one-stop shops where you can go in, you see a consultant, you get a mammogram, you get the ultrasound, and you pretty much have an understanding of where you're at quite quickly? Should we be doing more genomic testing of cancer, like mine was tested, in order to make sure that those who actually really need chemotherapy have chemotherapy, but those who don't necessarily need to have chemotherapy don't get it? I've already been sending 1 million text messages to relevant ministers about this. I have spoken to the Prime Minister about some of the issues that I've just mentioned, and, I will continue to do so.
And of course, once your treatment's done and you're back working 100% at Westminster as you were before, you can have those chats face to face, can't you?
It's very much a live conversation with my oncologist, and only this week, we were having a text exchange about the next stages, and he was very much of the view that, and I quote, that I would be back in Parliament to torment the front bench as early as hopefully February.
That was Tracy Crouch, Conservative MP, former Minister, and we all look forward to welcoming her back when she returns to Westminster, as promised there in February. And Kate, Tracy was talking there about how she wanted to be able to take part in more parliamentary proceedings from home and debates as well as just questions. And we've had some developments on that story tonight involving Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Yeah, so just before we came on air, Jacob Rees-Mogg tweeted that, he'd been very moved by what Tracy had explained, how she felt, completely blocked out of the process. And he's now looking at ways to make sure that the clinically extremely vulnerable can take part in Parliament in a much fuller way. And the timing of it's weird because obviously the PM now has to isolate. So it did slightly look like he's, put all of this out just to make sure that the PM can take part in digital proceedings this week. But Tracy then tweeted and said, actually, this was in train, a few days ago. And Jacob Rees-Mogg just wanted to let the House of Commons know first of all. But in the end, he's ended up tweeting about it this evening. But it's good news.
Because he is the leader of the House and it needs him involved in any changes to procedure. And presumably, Stephen, you'd welcome that, would you? Do you think it's a good move to make, and Claire as well?
Yes, absolutely. And, can I just say, what came through with that interview is what a genuinely lovely person Tracy Crouch is. Her warmth just shines through in every word that she says, and she's a great colleague. And we've discussed many things, but often football. She's a huge football fan, plays in the Parliament team. She's a Spurs fan, but we won't hold that against her. And she's just a lovely person. I wish her well. I hope she comes back soon, and she should absolutely be allowed to participate. And it sounds very positive that the leader of the House is doing the right thing.
And Claire?
No, I couldn't agree more. She's clearly got a very personal and valuable contribution to make, particularly on this topic, and I'm just so pleased that she's going to be back with us, hopefully in February.
And we'll keep an eye on Jacob Rees-Mogg and moves from the leader's office to see if things change on that. Now we have the front pages of the papers in. Kate, what have they got?
Well, I imagine they've been very hastily redrawn this evening because the news that the Prime Minister has to isolate because he's been in contact with someone who got a positive COVID result is on the front page of The Guardian. It's also on the front page of the iPaper as well. So that you'll see that tomorrow morning. We also have front pages that are dedicated to Brexit because this is, a huge crunch week. We hear this a lot, but this really is now getting down to the wire. So but the Express has an interesting take here. They have an exclusive story where, Boris Johnson's telling the EU, stop the bullying or we quit talks. Essentially, we will still leave on a no-deal basis. But then you contrast that with the Independent, and they're saying that, there's still so much to go. There's still such a long way. The idea that we're just basing things now around three small issues, that's actually not the case. It's so much more complicated. Things are very, very difficult.
And Adrian O'Neill, just a quick comment from you on that idea that unless the EU gives up its bullying demands, Boris Johnson is poised to walk out of these talks.
Well, Michel Barnier leads the negotiations for the EU, and I think he is one of the most calmest, patient and most respectful negotiators I've ever come across.
So, bullying?
I don't recognise it at all, I'm afraid.
All right. Well, I'd explore it if I had more time with you, but I haven't. Now, Kate, just another headline on the front of the Times.
Yeah, this is a very interesting story. So this is charges for using roads to fill a £40 billion budget hole. Apparently Chancellor Rishi Sunak is considering plans to charge motorists for using Britain's roads. And this is because of a shortfall in tax created by the switch to electric cars. He said to be very interested in the idea of national road pricing. I think this sounds very controversial. It's quite hard to actually work out whether they're talking about something like the M6 toll road, which people complained about at the time, but they got used to. And all of this is to try and offset this big hole that there's going to be in tax, and also to try and fit in with Boris Johnson's new green agenda.
And I mean, that hole in tax is massive, isn't it? And Claire, you know more than most about the financial restraints and the way that Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, is looking for ways, considering tax cuts. Charges for using roads, do you think that is true as a goer?
Well, I mean, there's been umpteen of these stories now, and I think what we've seen from the Chancellor, he's been very candid that over the medium to long term, we will have to fix the public finances. That is a really important thing to do. But until the Chancellor stands up at a budget and announces a measure, I would say the Treasury is full of lots of very smart officials who come up with ideas all the time, and the majority actually don't happen.
And in 20 seconds, Stephen, what would your constituents think of this?
Well, I think people know that the only way to really build back better is to grow the economy. We have to grow it in a sustainable way. The green agenda based on capital investment, a stimulus package, that's how to grow the economy so that the Exchequer gets the tax that it needs through growth, not through, I think, adding extra taxes, which could well indeed be a burden on business. So I think we need a fair balanced growth package. And where is the vision for that? Where is the plan? Where are the sector deals? We just don't see it. So that's what the Chancellor should be focused on.
OK, and we have the spending review coming up the week after next. That is all we've got time for this evening. Thanks to all my guests, Kate Proctor, Stephen Kinnock, Claire Coutinho and Ambassador Adrian O'Neill.